Good morning, everyone. I shall be very brief because the point of this morning is to hear from our fabulous first speaker, James Rebanks. But I just was honoured to be asked to introduce him because I'm not sure how many people in the room have read his work. Here's a copy of it, The Shepherd's Life, A Tale of the Lake District, which was rather ungenerously, I think, described by the Daily Mail as the surprise hit of the year. If you read any of it, I would say it's absolutely no surprise at all. And some of the other comments, like bloody marvellous, I think are more appropriate. And also a bit more seriously, but I think very aptly, that it's a triumphant pastoral for the 21st century. And this is one of the things about James's work that I think clearly makes him entirely appropriate for our symposium on landscape, but also which speaks to all of us in some way or another, whatever sort of life we've lived and wherever we come from, because all of us have this human sharing of land and landscape, which is so beautifully evoked in his book. It has sold 350,000 copies, so if you don't have yours yet, hurry while stocks last. It was a #1 bestseller in the UK. It's been translated into 16 or 17 languages. People in Norway, in Spain, in Japan, in Romania write letters to James telling him about the impact that this book has had on them. And you'll be glad to know that he's currently working on another book when he's not busy shepherding in the late hours of the night, which will be with us, I think, at Easter 2019. But before he wrote this book, and before he was almost full-time on his farm in the Lake District, he did some work for UNESCO. He's an expert in tourism to historic places and its impact on people. So in a way, this is a sort of self-ethnography and UNESCO project, you could say. And he worked with the Maasai, which is perhaps why I was asked to introduce him, because I am in no sense a lakeland shepherdess, much as I might wish I could be. He worked with the Maasai in Kenya, in Tanzania, and I think that the common humanity that we share across these ostensibly very different lands and landscapes when we're working with animals and when we're living in close proximity and understanding of our ecology and our animals is something that pulls us all together. And I would say that that's why this book's been such a success, because even if you can't really imagine yourself as a lakeland shepherd, what you find in here is really every aspect of humanity and a deep love and understanding of all the landscapes in our lives, whether they're actual, political, social, or anything else. So without further ado, I shall hand you over to the man himself, and please welcome James Rebanks.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, because I have a horrible habit of making these things not work properly, so bear with me a moment. I'd like to start off with a little quiz. Could you put your hand up if you're a full-time farmer? Okay. Put your hand up if one of your parents was a full-time farmer. Okay. Put your hand up if one of your grandparents was a full-time farmer. Okay, let's go one further. Put your hand up if one of your great-grandparents was a farmer. Okay. Something really weird happened in human history, didn't it? We used to, about half of us in the last 4 generations grew our own food, and now hardly anybody grows their own food. And there's something really weird at the heart of that, which is we trust other people. We've outsourced our food production to other people, and we have to trust them to do it well, or in a way that we would approve of. or often we just trust them to do it as cheaply as possible, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Bear with me. So I'm a shepherd in the Lake District. I sound much better in Jane's introduction than I am in real life. So thank you to Jane. I could have listened to more of that. That was lovely. We farm in the fells, what other people call the mountains or the moorland. We have about 600 ewes in the flock of sheep that we have. That's slightly larger than most of the flocks would have been historically. It means that I have about 1,500 sheep in total on my farm at the moment. There's only me doing that, except for today when my friend James is looking after the sheep because I'm here. Call me old-fashioned, but I think looking after 1,400 sheep should be enough to earn some kind of living. I don't think it should make me rich. I don't expect everybody else to give me money to have a comfortable lifestyle. But I'm not making anything like a living. And that isn't sort of the usual farmer whinging. The sheep that you're looking at there, they happen to be the posh ones that are kept for breeding, but some of their brothers go into the food chain. They're Herdwick meat, and Herdwick meat's pretty damn special. It was eaten at the Queen's coronation because they thought it was the best meat that you could have. The best Herdwick meat, which you can almost no longer get, was a 4 or 5 year old castrated male that had lived in the mountains, gone back to the mountains the whole time. And because they had the herbage and the sort of things that were available to eat in the mountains, they had this amazing, rich, textured, gamey flesh. But their brothers are now worth about £75 each. So if any of you walk into the auction where I sell my sheep, you can buy a sheep from me for about £75. When I was a kid, they still made basically between £40 and £75. If they kept it with inflation, they should now be worth about £460. Okay? Bear with me, I'm getting the boring stuff out of the way. So I'm selling my sheep for about a quarter of their real price from 40 years ago. I should be killing the meat market in the UK. I should be winning hands down. This should be amazing. I'm producing stuff a quarter of its price 40 years ago. What's actually happening? I'm dying. Everybody like me is dying. The farms like me, because industrial chicken is about 10 times cheaper than it was when I was a kid. So we've been pushed off the shelf, pushed out of consciousness, pushed out of recipe shows, pushed out of sort of food publications by the all-conquering cheap chicken. And we're told that we should modernize and become more efficient, and we should make our meat within about 15 to 20% of the price of industrial chicken. So all of the traditional farmers, I've set off in a very political frame of mind today, forgive me. All of the farmers that do what I do, which is to farm in a fairly organic, fairly free-range, historic way that's existed for about 5,000 years, are being told to get out of the way, disappear, or work out how to produce their meat for the same price as industrial chicken. So I have friends who are less romantic than I am. I think maybe we can win this battle in some crazy ideological way. Some of my friends are trying to work out how they can produce lamb at the same price as industrial chicken. So they think that society is telling them to lower the cost of what they produce massively. So they're trying to work out how you might industrialize sheep as chicken and pigs have been. They're trying to work out how you might have 20,000 or 100,000 sheep in a shed where it's all mechanized and one person on minimum wage can look after them. I despise that whole chain of thinking. I listened to Colin yesterday and I thought he was remarkable. I've never heard anybody speak for 15 minutes and everything that came out of his mouth made perfect sense to me. Okay, so these are the mountains where we graze our sheep. One of the amazing things about our landscape is it's common land. So for those of you that don't know about common land, it doesn't belong to us. The deal historically was that the peasants where we live, and I'm from the peasants if you like, could graze their sheep on the local aristocrat, the local lord's wasteland. This was manorial wasteland. And guess what the rent was? The rent was about once every 5 or 10 years you had to pick up a pitchfork or a spike or something and go and fight against the Scots. Okay? That was the rent. So for those of you that are historians, you should really look at the battles between the English and the Scots because it's full of posturing and then armies running away. Okay? Because the armies are full of farmers who are trying to comply with their rent agreements for grazing the mountains, but not really prepared to die for it. which I love. And then there was this fantastically messy and English small-scale revolution in our landscape about 200 years ago, where our aristocrats said, okay, it's time to fight the Scots. And we went to the usual meeting places and we said, actually, we don't want to fight the Scots. How about we fight you instead? What do you think of that? And they didn't reckon much of that, so they basically let us off the hook. And for 200 years, we've kept the legal right to graze their mountains, but we don't pay them any rent, which I think is a fantastic way to sort out most of society's problems. Bear with me, I'm going to read you a little bit from my book. Okay. And I should explain about this passage that when I first dreamt of writing a book, it was going to be a very angry book indeed. I started dreaming about it when I was 20 years old, and it was going to be a book about a son and a father who couldn't agree about anything. And it was going to be about this grumpy, slightly brutal dad who couldn't see how brilliant his enlightened son was. Thankfully, nobody gave me a publishing contract when I was in my 20s, and I had the chance to grow up. And a couple of years ago, when I did get lucky and people did ask me to write a book, it happened in parallel to something really sad, which is that my father was dying of cancer. And in the intervening 20 years, I'd come to realize that actually my father was my hero. The 20-year-old anger was wasted, that this was actually a very decent man, a humble man who worked his whole life doing something very humble and simple. And in those intervening years, I'd come to realize how much I loved him and respected him. So that probably informed the writing of this passage. There's no beginning and there is no end. The sun rises and falls each day. The seasons come and go. The days, months and years alternate through sunshine, rain, hail, wind, snow and frost. The leaves fall each autumn and burst forth again each spring. The earth spins through the vastness of space. The grass comes and goes with the warmth of the sun, and the farms and the flocks endure bigger than the life of a single person. We're born, we live our working lives and die, passing like the oak leaves that blow across our land in the winter. We're each a tiny part of something enduring, something that feels solid, real and true. Our farming way of life has roots deeper than 5,000 years into the soil of this landscape. I was born in July 1974 into a world that centred on an old man and his 2 farms. He was a proud farmer called William Hugh Rebanks, Hughie to his mates, Grandad to me. He had a rough, whiskery face when you kissed him goodnight. He smelt of sheep and cattle and only had 1 yellow tooth, but he could clean the meat off a lamb chop with it like a jackal. So I had a funny life story. When I was a kid, I worshipped this old man who was my grandfather, who was a shepherd. And I thought then, and I still do in much of my heart now, still think he had the coolest life ever. He got up in the morning and he did what he thought was right, and he did the work that he loved, and he had these amazing sheepdogs, and he lived in a beautiful place, and everybody seemed to respect him, and he just loved his life. And he was not just a farmer, but he was like an amateur naturalist. So I would follow him around the fields and he would show me where the foxes had gone under the fences and they'd left the hair on the wire, or he would show me in the log shed where the swallows had nested in the eaves of the shed. And I just remember, to me this man was like God. I thought, he's everything I want to be when I grow up. But of course I grew up in the 1970s and the 1980s when small farms were beginning to struggle and to go broke. And into a world where being a farmer or wanting to be a farmer wasn't very cool. So the book that I wrote is about going to school and realizing that the teachers wanted me to not be a farmer, quite specifically not be a farmer, that it was seen as a slightly backwards thing, a slightly provincial thing, that it showed a lack of imagination, and that really smart boys like me, I was a kid that liked to read and probably reasonably smart at some things, my job was to go to university, to go and live in a city, to conspicuously achieve things in the modern world that people respected. And I didn't like that at all. And I dealt with it in a very immature childlike or teenage way, which was to sort of say, screw you. If this isn't about my people and this isn't about my values, I'm not playing this game. So what did I do? I did really annoying things like I studied for the exams. This is when I'm 15, and this is really not cool, but I studied for the exams and thought it would be hilariously funny to do a brilliant answer to each of the questions, but in the wrong answer box on the paper. Yeah. And completely crashing all of my exams, thinking this was hilariously cool. And the moment when I realised it wasn't cool was I bumped into my old geography teacher a couple of weeks after the results had come out. And I've never seen, and nobody's ever looked at me in such a shrivelling, pathetic manner in all my life. This guy just looked at me, he'd read the paper. And he just looked at me, and it was probably one of the moments where you grow up and you think, what did I just do? That was pathetic. He didn't have to say a word. He just gave me one of those looks that sometimes an adult gives you. And so I left school when I was 15. I had no qualifications. I went to work on the farm. It was both the best thing I ever did, because I worked with my father and my grandfather, and I learned all about their way of life, and I worked alongside them. There's lots and lots of things about it. I mean, it was the best thing I ever did. And I think you should all go home and encourage your children and grandchildren to crash their exams and leave school and work on a farm. No, not that. But there was a lot of good in it for me. It gave me a place to go, to escape from the things I didn't like and to grow up a little bit. And it gave me time to do that. Unfortunately, it also had a bad side, which was there wasn't really any money on the farm. And there's 3 quite big egos on the farm. So I'm a 15-year-old ego, my dad has a 40-year-old ego, and we still have this 80-year-old guy knocking around who thinks he's the chief. So all the things I'd loved as a 10-year-old about my grandfather start to wear a little bit when I leave school. I realised that he's actually quite pushy. He's a bit of a patriarch figure. He's actually quite horrible to my dad and won't let my dad have very much authority on the farm. So when I get to 17 or 18 years old, I'm bored out my skull in the evenings, is the truth of it. So I don't know how it is in like the small towns where some of you might be from, but where we live, the standard form of entertainment when you were 17 years old was to drink cans of cider in the local car park, or to drive in your car around the car parks doing donuts and trying to impress girls. It's actually the worst way in the world to impress any kind of girl, I later learned. But I quickly got bored of that. And I didn't know what to do, and in the house where we lived, we didn't have a particularly wealthy family. There was one TV, which would be the same in some of your houses. Who chose what channel the TV was on? Granddad or Dad? So I can't even watch what TV I want in the evening, so I'm sort of getting really angsty about all this. I'm being told what to do all day long on the farm, and then I come in and there's no space in the house. So to cut a long story short, I escaped into books. My mother had an amazing bookcase full of books that her father had left her when he died. And like the first book I pick up, I didn't know how lucky I was. I didn't know what these books were, but the first book I pick up is like Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. The next book I pick up is by Camus, and the third book's by George Orwell. The fourth one's this book called A Shepherd's Life by W.H. Hudson, which is a really, really lovely book about Wiltshire, not a million miles away from here, and about Shepherd 100 years ago. And literally, in the space of about a month, I went from somebody who didn't care about books particularly and thought education was nothing to do with me, to somebody who wanted to be a writer. And I wanted to be a writer and a shepherd like my grandfather. This is not a good career choice, I can tell you. The world is not full of opportunities for people who are shepherds who want to be writers. You kind of have to make this stuff up. And it took me, I'll come to that in a moment, it took me about 20 years to work out how to do all of that stuff, and in the end I actually got quite lucky. I started a Twitter account for my farm, okay? It's called @HurdyShepherd1, and every day I share the story of what we're doing on the farm. I tell the story of my sheepdogs and my sheep. Thank you. And it now has nearly 100,000 people follow my farm on Twitter every day, which is insane. And when my dog Floss had puppies 2 or 3 years ago, I put the birth of the puppies on there, and 1.3 million people watched the birth of my dog having puppies. Does that matter? Maybe not. Or maybe it tells us something about modern life, where people don't get to see things born, don't get to see things die anymore. And maybe I'm just got lucky because I share that stuff with people. I also share it with my family. I've got 3 children, a little boy called Isaac and 2 older girls called Molly and Bee. That is Isaac's sheep, I can tell by the blue ear tag. She's called Moss. And Isaac had just delivered these 2 lambs with his own hands. He doesn't look too convinced about being a farmer yet, does he? But seriously, he's a lovely kid. And his 2 big sisters as well. They all work with us on the farm. So a farm is both a business and not a business at the same time. A family farm is everything that you do. It's your whole life, it's your values, it takes up your every waking hour, it's part of what your children do when they're growing up. It's only occasionally about money, which is a good thing, because there ain't any bloody money in it. This is my daughter Molly, and what's going on in the background is we have this very, very, very strong and vibrant shepherding culture where we live. So In each of the valleys there is something called a shepherd's meet, and it's where, when they gathered all of the mountains, there were stray sheep from different flocks. And to return them to their rightful owners, there's a whole culture emerged about meeting at certain times in certain places on the edge of the mountain. And because shepherds compete about everything, literally everything shepherds compete on, it became a competition. Who has the best lamb? Who has the best ewe? Who has the sheep with the best fleece? Who is the sheep with the best teeth? So we have these things called shepherds' meets. And my daughter is following daughters are following in a very long line of female shepherds. People tend to assume that shepherds must be men. It's entirely incorrect in our landscape. The small farms where we live were often subsistence farms, and for the last several centuries, the men often went off the farms to work in the mines or in the woods or on the roads, and quite often the women were left to do the farming. And quite often to this day, you have very, very powerful, I say this respectfully, very opinionated and strong-willed women who are in charge of the flocks of sheep, and quite often the men still go off the farm and do other things. The funniest thing about this photograph is my neighbour is what is called the queen of the Herdwicks, the queen of this breed, because she breeds some of the best ones. And my ambition and my children's ambition is to beat her. It's the ultimate compliment we can pay. And this was the first lamb that my daughter ever had out of her own sheep. And we went to this show, and Jean, the queen of the Herdwicks, is lovely to my children. So she was chatting away to my daughter, encouraging her, telling her how to do this thing properly. And then she looks down and realizes that my daughter's sheep is capable of beating her. Suddenly, all bets are off. My daughter's not an 11-year-old anymore. This is fierce. There's not another word spoken all day. They're just competitors. And my daughter was smirking at me. She was like, she's really mad. So girl power, I say, in terms of shepherding. These are my dogs. So this is Meg and Tan and Floss and Sky, a dog that we sold to somebody else, actually, Sky at the back, who's a lovely dog. So the whole way of life that we have is entirely possible because of the sheepdogs. So the mountains where we go is a huge unenclosed range of mountains. To bring the flocks of sheep down for the mountains takes 10 people, men and women, and 25 dogs like these, 2 days. So this is crazy. To most lowland farmers, they think we're some kind of weird anachronism. What do you mean you don't own your land? What do you mean other people's sheep are in the same place? What do you mean it takes 10 of you 2 days to gather a mountain? It makes no sense. And by rights, we should all want to lie down and disappear in the face of modern efficient agriculture. No such thing is happening. There have never been so many young people interested in what we're doing. And I love that. I'm so proud of the young people where I live because they're making a really smart decision, which is everything doesn't happen in cities, actually. Cities are marvellous. There's loads of wonderful opportunities in them, but they're not the best places often for many, many young people. They're quite often being asked to do low-paid work in Starbucks and other places like that. And these kids are making a very conscious decision. They're saying, okay, maybe we can't earn very much money in our landscape, but we're part of a community and we're part of a tradition. And we're doing something that we respect and we love. And okay, maybe we have to have another job, or we might have to work in a pub or do whatever else we have to do, but we care about these things. And there's been a huge sort of cultural awakening since I was a kid. I was probably the last generation that was in decline, where there was a decline. So my friends when I was a kid thought we had to give up. We sort of bought into the prevailing sort of narrative about this. The kids now have completely rejected it. There's a sort of radicalism going on. And I think I don't know how economically aware they are, but they've looked at things like the banking crisis in the last 10 years. They're looking at growing inequality, and they've got principles, and they're sticking to them. They want to make a life in their own communities. And I loved what Catherine said yesterday. You know, when she showed us that wonderful map of the Highlands of Scotland, and she said some people want it all to disappear, but we Scots have got a different idea. We want to live in our landscape and farm it and have a future in it. Well, I feel exactly the same way. I've got no idea how I'm doing for time, so I'm hoping somebody will tell me when I've got about 5 minutes left. So the whole landscape where we live is shaped around the pattern of the sheep going to and from the mountains. So this is a lane, or a lonin, we would call it. And my farm is in the far distance, and it takes me about 3 hours. Even when I've got to the edge of the mountain, it still takes me 3 hours to walk the sheep down to our land. And we do that 6 to 8 times a year. And those are the lambs, the black sheep there are the lambs, which are coming down from the mountain. And one of the things I really, really love about what we do, and it makes you feel so small, but in a good way, is that those sheep are genetically the direct descendants of the sheep that were there 1,000 years ago, and they're probably the direct descendants of the sheep that were there 4,500 years ago. And every single summer, in that period, somebody like me, man, woman, whatever, took those flocks, that exact group of sheep, back to the mountains, And the mother teaches the daughters how to live on that part of the mountain they're hefted, which is a word that means they hold to their particular place on the mountain, even when there's no shepherd there, even when there's no fences. And I kind of love the fact that I'm part of something that's unbroken in that way. It makes you feel good. I think it's lovely to do something. And if something isn't sustainable that's been there for 4,500 years, I don't know what the word sustainable means. So I like things that have survived a long time. I think it tells you something valuable about them. Bear with me. So this is us gathering the mountain. There's some new technology, so on the flatter parts of the mountains, people will use the motorbikes, but most of the important work is done in the ancient traditional ways with dogs and sticks. That's bringing the flocks of sheep down across the mountains, and you can see people in the distance all have their individual parts of the mountain that they've gathered and they bring down together. By the way, if you have a system that's existed for several thousand years and it relies on you all grazing the same piece of land, you end up with a set of ethics which put trust way ahead of everything else. So this system would break down if people stole from each other. You could cheat. I could take my neighbour's sheep and pretend that they're mine and cut their ear tags out or pretend that they're mine. But it doesn't happen, or it almost never happens. And when we find a sheep on the mountain that has no mark on, we almost break out into a fight, trying to argue that it isn't ours. Because your good name, your integrity, and the trust that you have with your neighbours is your greatest asset. I have to trust them, and they have to trust me, and you end up with this incredibly strict code of behaviour. Don't even do something that might look like you did something wrong. Give the other person the thing rather than claim it yourself. And there's a whole other bunch of culture that's emerged around this thing. So if you have sheep in mountains and there's different flocks mixed on the sort of open common land, then you need a system of earmarks. So any of you that are from Norway or Sweden or places like that will recognize some of this because reindeers have the same thing. And I've never read a good history book about this, but my working assumption is that as farming and as pastoralism spread across Europe, 13,000, 10,000 years ago, this was something that spread from the Middle East with them, this system of earmarks. So in the Lake District, you can tell the oldest flock in the valley because it's a simple snipping off of the end of the ear. The second flock had to be something slightly more complex. The third, and it goes on like that. So you end up with the 30th flock in the valley, 1,000 years later, having a super complex sort of set of little holes and things. But again, this is all sort of part of the culture. And something really exciting, which I hope will happen tomorrow, is that this landscape is being judged by the UNESCO World Heritage Committee in Krakow tomorrow. And everybody cross your fingers and wish as well. Our landscape tomorrow may become a World Heritage Site. Based partly on this, and I should be honest, partly based on its history of conservation and the way that it's shaped the way that people think about landscapes around the world. So it's not just about what I do, it's about those other things as well. I occasionally get journalists say to me, oh, your shepherding friends must think you're really great because you wrote a book. No, my shepherding friends respect me or don't respect me based on how good a shepherd I am. The thing's all about the sheep, it's all about how good you are at your work. So the best thing that happened to me in 2015 was not writing a best-selling book, it was the fact I actually bred the best sheep that my family had ever bred before. It was a sheep called Darwin, and he broke the breed record and made £5,500. So if you ask my friends, what does James Rebanks do? They'll say, oh, he breeds good Herdwick sheep. And then they'll go, oh yeah, he does that other book stuff. But it's okay, he's got good sheep. And they're probably, like a lot of working people, probably a little bit suspicious of books and things. They're probably watching very carefully to see whether I'm still a good shepherd in a couple of years' time, or whether I'm just a guy that talks a lot. And one of the most proud things you can do in our landscape is to breed a sheep that is so good it goes into this book called the Flock Book. And each year, the best 10 or so sheep in each of the breeds that we breed has this sort of portrait done, which is taken incredibly seriously. For any of you that take photographs, you may chuckle at this, but there's a whole group of professional sheep photographers who do nothing else but take these incredibly proud, upright pictures of these sheep standing perfectly and catching them in the right light. I love it. Anyway, it's quite hot today, isn't it? I want to give you another reading, because I'm slightly random and I jump around, but you'll forgive me. I thought it was a little hot, so I'll give you a reading about the snow, because the truth is, shepherding in summer is easy. The sheep go to the mountain, I have to check things are okay, there's a lot of work to be done, but it's fairly easy, I can do it. Winter's a different matter altogether, winter tests you. I step out into that Bruegel painting of the snow and the crows, Oak trees and thorn dikes stand out in the white like black coral. I feel alive, necessary and needed. I have to be my best self today, fight what has happened or creatures will go hungry. The snow is heavy now and layering up fast on the land. Leading the hay to the ewes on the quad bike in heavy snow, I become white myself. Thick white snowflakes carpet me as I head up the road. You see them falling by the millions like duck down feathers. Some land on my face, crumple into my warm eye sockets and blind me with a soft wetness. I feel the lightness of a snowflake land on my tongue, soft, fat and delicate. Like the snow god had placed it on my tongue for Holy Communion. The quad bike tyres make a crunching sound packing down the snow on the road. The field gate I open has a 3-inch layer of soft snow across its top bar. The first flock I go to feed are away in a gill or a ravine, where the mothers and grandmothers have taught them to shelter when the gales come in. Mountain sheep have a sixth sense for the weather on their own territory. I find them under Scots pine trees, 40 feet beneath the danger of wind and drifts. The oldest ewe will have led them here and will stand stubbornly if the younger ewes try to lead them out to danger. The flock takes its cue from its elders. They know they're safe here, with tussock grass to chew on to keep them alive if the snow lasts for days. This place is almost as good as a barn, windless and watered by the beck that still carves the gill out of the mountainside. I throw emergency rations of hay down the sides and they gather to it. The ewes tug a gobful away from the slices and start to chew. With every mouthful I see them eat, I loosen up. Ewes that are sheltered and fed with some dry hay can survive here for days and days. I count them and learn that 2 are missing. But then suddenly, these 2 as well are tumbling down the bank for the hay. Relief. These 2 young ewes have been to scratch through the snow for sweeter grass. They'll be okay now. They will hold to the hay through the snowfall. But there is no time to dwell here admiring the scenery. I have other flocks to feed, and the snow still falls heavily, and the valley is changing about me. So, how long have I got left? Go on, help me out. How are we doing for time? 5 minutes? Okay, bear with me. So, one of the nicest things on a farm is that you follow the whole cycle of life and death. You have a very realistic connection to where food comes from. I see things born, and I often save their lives, and I see things die, and I know that I'm responsible for that too. And I'm okay with that. I grew up with that. I understand that process. I actually love talking to many of you because as foodie people, most of you are quite comfortable with that. You have to come to terms with it, don't you? You have to think, hang on a minute, am I comfortable with an animal dying so that I can eat it? And is that a difficult choice? I think it should be. I think you should think about it carefully. And I think we need to be really careful about wasting food and giving it the respect that it deserves. And I think you have a particular awareness of that if you have followed that animal through its whole life. But most of my life is about keeping things alive. Some people misunderstand that. They think farming is a sort of brutal thing leading inevitably to death. It's actually the other way around. I spend all of my life trying to keep things alive. And I don't know why I've put a silly picture of a sheep sticking its tongue out, but we'll... But the thing about our landscape, and why I love that particular breed of sheep, is that they're the native breed of our landscape. They've got this hugely long history of evolving to cope with that landscape and of selective breeding. And what they do incredibly well is that they can survive the worst weather that probably most sheep in the world can survive outside. So if you travel further north than us to Norway, Sweden, places like that, they have sheep there, but most of those sheep winter inside. Okay? So they don't actually have to be quite as tough as our sheep, a little bit further south, which live on mountains where it isn't incredibly cold, but there might be 6 months of the year where it's damp and cold. And that's actually killing weather for sheep. It makes it very, very hard. It gives them pneumonia. And these sheep are probably the toughest sheep for living on mountains in cold, wet weather. Why is that important? Because it's actually how people lived in that landscape for the first 4,950 years. It's only in the last 5 years we've started to think these things are obsolete. I personally think that in the future we may have to go back to traditional farming systems and local farming systems, much as Colin described, because without oil, without antibiotics, without pesticides and herbicides, and without many of the chemical things that we now use, which are already ceasing to work, we may have to go back to doing things in the way that worked. So rotational farms, mixed farming, native breeds that can produce protein and red meat from their own landscape. Does that mean that we can magically put the clock back to 1930 or 1870? No, not a bit of it. I'm not romantic in that sense. I think we're going to have to find modern ways to use the old farming systems. There's going to have to be a degree of modernization, probably changes in scale, probably clever ways to do it with less people, unfortunately. But do I think the old ways really, really matter and they're key for the future? Absolutely. I'm utterly convinced of that. One of the challenges we have at the moment is that there's a very passionate argument at the moment for wilding the uplands in Britain. And it's an argument that's extremely sincere. It's made by people who want there to be more wilderness and think maybe we should do that in the uplands because the farming is marginal. And I absolutely 100% respect that point of view, but it is incomplete. It doesn't take into account traditional farming and food. It doesn't take into account what the people in that landscape want. It doesn't take into account how utterly reliant that idea is upon the unsustainability of industrial farming in the lowland. So what that idea is really saying is, let's throw it all in. Let's throw our entire future in with the really nasty industrial stuff in the lowlands and free the uplands up for birds and butterflies entirely. Now, I think that's a really good challenge for people like me, but I think the answer is not entirely wild, it's partly wild. Looking after the traditional hay meadows, looking after the traditional oak woodland, planting new trees, doing better things to prevent flooding. And we try to do those things on our own farm, where we're trying very, very hard indeed to rise to that challenge and to do the right things. But I'm just going to leave you with that really, which is I believe passionately that we need those old things. There are no other sheep in the world that can survive in our mountains like those sheep can. And a similar truth is true about nearly all native breeds. And I was on a farm in Wiltshire, not very far from here, a week ago, and I went to meet an arable farmer, and he was telling me about growing his grain. And he'd been over the field that we looked at, which was a couple of weeks away from being harvested, 7 different times with pesticides to grow the grain. He's under immense pressure to do it cheaper than his father and his grandfather did, just like I am, so he feels pushed to do that. If he sells grain and it has any imperfections or any weed seed in it, he's penalised very, very heavily by the people that want to make the bread that we're all eating. And he was just really, really trapped. And I looked around his farm and he was trying to do the right things around it. He was trying to restore the heathland for butterflies and other things. So I'm just going to leave you with that really, which is I think farmers have been part of some of the problems in the countryside over the last 50 years. They have been responsible for some of the things we don't want to happen in the landscape. But it wasn't just their fault, it was all of our fault. We've pushed them to it, we've driven them to it, we've asked them to do it in many cases. And the solution, I think, needs to be to turn that round, to have a stronger relationship between you and me, and a stronger conversation between us about how I do what I do and whether you approve of it or not and how I might do it better, and an honest conversation from me about the fact that that will cost you more, that we have to spend more on food, and if you want the things you say you want, then somehow we need to do this in a grown-up way. We need to say, okay, Mr. Farmer, here's the list of things we want from you that are better than you're doing at the moment, and here's our commitment, which is it's going to cost more money. And that, as Colin said, that leads you into some really complicated territory about our society as a whole, which is probably structured around cheap food. So we have a very unequal society that tends to devalue work and create a lot of low-value employment. What happens to those people when food's more expensive? That becomes one of the key challenges. And it isn't one that we can ignore. So it becomes about how we structure our whole society and culture. I'm going to shut up now because I've gone all over the place in the last 30 minutes. I've really, really enjoyed being here. It's the most bonkers and wonderful thing I've been to because everybody you speak to, everyone's got like a wonderful specialism, hasn't they, or passion. They care about this or that or the other. And it's the first do I've ever been to where people could recite Seamus Heaney poetry over Irish whiskey. So thank you.